what can your dog actually do that another human couldn't replicate?
How did you get him to the point where he was able to navigate through those very high level distractions? Now, how do you do crate training specifically? What are the first things you want to start doing when you are working with a new puppy? And let's go down to the details. Today's guest is Heather Lowell, an animal behaviorist, service dog trainer, and pioneer in science-based rehabilitation. Heather's life has been dedicated to saving and advancing the lives of animals. She's trained service dogs, rehabilitated aggressive dogs, and now mentors trainers around the world through the NAPOPO Gold Schools and upcoming service dog programs. Where are the puppies allowed to have direct interaction, and with who and what?
Right at about 8 to 10 months old, when that dog has started to reach the second period of their critical development, now they understand mortality and they understand that not everything is going to be nice to them. And if they assume that every public person is going to touch them and they see someone who maybe they're a little bit conflicted by interacting with, you get that first big blow up. Because the dog's like, I'm just going to get ahead of this. I'm going to tell that person I want nothing to do with them before they have a chance to come over and touch me. And that's where reactivity is born.
Heather Lowell, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's so good to be here. And I'm happy that we get to finally meet virtually after Bill Church connected us.
Yeah, that's one of the really great things about the dog training world. It's actually much smaller than a lot of people think, and you end up meeting a lot of people, which is really cool. I want to jump right into the service dog training because that's what people are here for, and that's something that you specialize in. I know you do all kinds of other training as well, but we're really going to focus on service dog training. And I want to start with some of the most basic questions just to lay the groundwork, and then we can go into more complex actual training to teach a dog specific tasks that could help someone with a disability. So the first one, when someone's looking to get a dog to train for service dog work, what are the right qualities or the right temperament that you're looking for, that you're trying to identify to increase the likelihood that someone's going to be successful with their new dog that they're trying to train as a service dog?
Perfect. That's a really good question. One of the things that you really want to watch out for is you want to make sure that the dog has nerves of steel, because they are going to be put into many situations that are inherently uncomfortable for a dog. Our world is already very uncomfortable for our dogs, but for service dogs, they have to be under public scrutiny and under a magnifying glass for their entire life. And I can't tell you the amount of times I've just walk through an airport and every other person has literally screamed or shrieked or launched for my dog because they see a cute dog in public. So they have to have nerves of steel. What I look for in my dog is I want a dog that is very confident, that is creative, that is calm. And I want a dog that isn't necessarily social, but a dog that is low in defense drive and very high in confidence. And so is it all right if I break that down a little bit more?
Yes, I would love for you to break it down. And let's do it for two different types of situations, or actually let's shoot for three. So someone who's getting a puppy that they want to train as a service dog, someone who's getting an older dog, and one who's trying to rescue a dog for service dog work.
Perfect. I will just go ahead and address the elephant in the room. That rescue dog is not a good option.
But it's possible.
It could be. There are definitely always the unicorn dogs that make it in the world. However, stability comes from genetics. And because we have been selecting genetics in dogs for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, those genetic markers that we can see in mom, dad, great grandpa, great grandma will show up in your pups. And we also have to take into account the concept of epigenetics. And what epigenetics is even if you have certain genes that are innately already in the dog, they may or may not be switched on or off depending on the rearing and also the life of the mother and the life of the mother during pregnancy. So, for example, if you have a pregnant female who is naturally calm and stable, but they live on the streets during their pregnancy and they are encountering a lot of stress, maybe
Mhm.
poor nutrition, the epigenetic switches of those entire litters are going to get flipped in different ways. So, there is no way to guarantee that a stable mother will have stable pups if there isn't a perfect environment throughout the entirety of the pregnancy and during the critical period of the puppies as well.
Oh, well, and that's what breeders aim for, especially when they're breeding for something as specific as service dog work. And I brought up the rescue dogs because
Mhm.
I'm not sure if you know, but I had a show on Animal Planet years ago called Rescue Dog to Super Dog. And we rescue dogs and we train them to be service dogs, very basic tasks. But out of the 12 dogs, there were, I don't remember how many, but not all of them completed the training.
Mhm.
And it took us, I think, either 2 or 3 months of
That's
going to
pretty good.
every single shelter in LA every single day and looking at all the dogs. I went to the shelter so much that I was starting to learn all the dogs by name. I was there almost as much as the staff was. So, doable, very, very difficult.
Very difficult. And I'm sure when you were going to the shelter, you weren't picking the cutest dog,
No,
which
definitely
m-
not.
most people, when they do go rescue a dog, they are basing that off of looks or like an emotional attachment to the animal. But that's not necessarily going to make a very good service dog because
Mhm.
service dogs need to be quite independent in their work, especially if they're doing something really critical like medical alert or some kind of mobility assistance.
And getting a dog from a breeder greatly increases the odds that you're going to be successful. And when you're investing as much time as required to train a service dog, you want to make sure you're putting that time into the right dog
Absolutely.
because not every dog is made the same and not every dog is going to be good at certain jobs. So let's say you found a breeder that has some nice pups. They've been
Mhm.
breeding for service dog work for quite a while. What is
Mhm.
it you look for? Do you evaluate the puppies yourself, or do you ask the breeder or tell the breeder rather what you're looking for and the type of service dog work that that dog's going to have to do? Is there something specific that you focus on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I typically defer to the breeder because they know their lines and they know their dogs very well. So the last puppy that I selected, I looked over 36 puppies prior to choosing this one, and I flew all the way out to Missouri to get him. And I looked at puppies over a span of about 4 years before selecting this one dog. And part of that is because the task work that he's doing is going to be dynamic, meaning the work is going to change with the degradation of his handler and with the change of her own medical issues that she's working through. So I needed a dynamic dog that could continue to learn new tasks throughout the entirety of his life. So I told the breeder exactly what I was looking for, and we looked at a couple of pups, yes or no. We looked at a couple of more. I typically prefer to select a dog during their critical period because I know how to do a lot of very important socialization during the critical period.
And what do you mean
However,
by critical period?
so the critical period is a point in time in a dog's brain. And actually, all animals have a critical period. Some have multiple. It's a point in time where think of their brain like a sandbox. And during this time, any experience they have is drawing a line in the sand and they're normalizing those experiences. So they see a mailman, that's a line. They hear a loud noise, that's a line. They meet a new dog, that's a line. And then when the critical period shuts, we pour concrete over that sandbox, and those lines are there forever.
And
Now,
this would be the imprinting stage then, right?
exactly, exactly. And typically, the more things that are trying to eat that animal, the shorter the critical period is,
Mhm.
because anything that isn't drawn during that time, an animal will innately fear. So if you think about it, the first curious dog that wanted to investigate a snake got bit, and those genetics were culled from their ancestry. The first dog that wanted to go investigate a cliff and got a little too close and fell over. Those genetics were culled out of the
Mhm.
ancestry. And so these critical periods serve a very important role in our animals' lives where they can normalize things that are not going to hurt them. And typically for a dog, that is between 7 and 12 weeks of age. So at that point in time, they've seen mom, litter mates. In the wild, if we're thinking about wolf pups, mom has maybe brought back like a half dead meal that they can practice hunting. They might have done a little bit of social interaction with the rest of their pack and maybe gone 5 or 6 steps outside their den.
And if you're getting a puppy, you said 7 weeks. Is that
Mhm.
the age you try to get them at if you're going to be doing service dog training with a puppy, or do you prefer to wait a little bit longer, 8, 9, maybe 10 weeks?
I prefer to wait a little longer because mom also teaches a lot of very important skills, and there's a lot of social dynamic learning that happens during their critical period as well. I personally have a dog who is very paternal and intact, so he can do a lot of that social learning himself. Like if the puppy bites a little too hard, he can teach by inhibition, by biting the puppy back at that same pressure so they can kind of start to understand how to have a bite break, and so on and so forth. But if you are bringing a puppy into a sterile environment with no dogs, I would highly suggest you wait until the dog is closer to 12 or 13 weeks old so it can have that social learning during its critical period with its female.
And you said talking to the breeder is really important. How could someone find the right breeder? And how do they know they're talking to the right breeder?
That's a really good question because a lot of breeders will say that their dogs are certain things. Some questions that I are the must ask questions for a breeder is what are you breeding for? And I don't really care of if they're titled in, any kind of AKC or confirmation. I want to know that their dogs are healthy, that they have good OFAs, good hips, good bones, and I'm not going to be investing a lot of time and energy into a dog that maybe won't last as long. But if you have a breeder who is hesitant to let you meet both the mother and the sire, that's a red flag. If you have a breeder who talks about how wonderful her dog is, but it never leaves the property, that's a red flag. And if you're not allowed to directly interact with the dog, that's a huge red flag for a breeder. So I want to see that a breeder is genetically selecting for temperament, not looks, because an ugly service dog is still better than a service dog who genetically is set up to fail because they don't possess the nerve that is required for the work they will be doing in their life.
And there's probably a lot of other details as well. Do you have an article or perhaps a blog maybe that you've written about this that I could send people to so they can read it directly from there?
Yes, I have a Patreon, and one of the collections in the Patreon is specifically on service dogs. So we have the whole selection process, the rearing process, and then the task training process.
Okay, perfect. So that's in the description. I don't want to spend too much time talking about that because I really do like to talk about the training. So that resource is available. And another thing I want to hit on very quickly is the legal requirements, because this is
Yes.
something people often ask me about, knowing that I had that show on Animal Planet. And you've probably trained way more service dogs than I have. I actually haven't trained that many, but I help as many people as possible. So I've done a lot of indirect work. And that's a very, very common question. How do you address that?
Yes. So legally, there is no such thing as a service dog registry. There is nowhere that you can go register a dog, create a dog, there's no certification process. And so even if you were to just quickly Google requirements for a service dog, I guarantee the first few things that pop up are lying to you. It'll be register your dog here or make your dog a service dog or here's all the information.
Mhm.
And they look very formal, and they will send you like a vest and a fake certificate. And, you can spend $100 and feel as though you have a service animal. But legally, there is no such thing as a service dog registry. And the only two questions that someone is allowed to ask you when you do have a service dog is that a service dog? And is it performed to train a specific task for you? They can't ask you what the task is. They can't ask you about your medical history, and they can't ask you to show them the dog tasking.
That's really valuable information. And how do they know if they are online looking at something to tell whether or not it's real. We were talking about it before we jumped on.
Yeah, typically the proof is in the pudding. Like, you can, I know there is a website somewhere that Bill was telling me about that it's a fake service dog spotting organization where they just see dogs out in public that are vested and, show different clips
Mhm.
of them jumping on tables or biting at kids or, it's one of the most common statements that I get when I'm traveling with my dog is, wow, I can tell he's a real service dog.
Yeah. And what I was talking about too was the ADA website.
Oh, yes. So I think that's just ada.gov. You want to
Mhm.
make sure it's a .gov. It's not a .com or net or anything else like that. Perfect. That's
Yeah, and
exactly what you're looking for.
that's what it looks like, and that's the link that I actually send people when they ask. I say, you can go here, you can look at the actual requirements for a service dog and get the information directly from the source.
Yes.
Okay, cool. And so the next one, we kind of skipped over this, so I do want to go back.
Mhm.
Picking a dog that is already past the imprinting stage, an older
Mhm.
dog or even adolescent, but just no longer that really young puppy stage. So let's say anywhere from 9 months to 2 years.
Mhm.
What do you look for in that type of situation? Or do you say, no, I don't want it. I want a puppy if I'm going to do this the best way possible?
It depends on where my puppy is coming from. If I know the handler and I know that they raise the puppy in the way that I like puppies to be reared for service work, then it doesn't really matter. And honestly, it's easier for me because then I get to skip a lot of what I call making a monster. Because in the beginning, I don't want to put a lot of control on my service dog. I don't want to put a lot of rules on my service dog. I kind of want them to be a little chaos monster. And if I let them loose in my house, I want to see a confident 5-month-old or 6-month-old dog that is running and jumping on my kitchen table and climbing on cabinets and pulling things off shelves, because all of those could be reformed into tasks. But what I can't do is go back in time and tell a dog who's been punished for counter surfing that now he needs to jump onto the counter and grab life-saving medication.
Mhm. And that's something that could be applied to pet dogs as well. Maybe not to the
Absolutely.
same extreme, but using a lot of differential reinforcement. We're going to reinforce the things that we like, and we're not going to start punishing the dog too early to create a negative association to where the dog doesn't have that desire to learn, or where we start to make them cautious because we've done corrections too early in the game. And something I say to people that I train with or clients, I say, if I were to give you a puzzle and then every time you did something wrong, I apply pressure or I gave you some kind of correction, you would become very cautious with the actions that you take moving forward. We want
Absolutely.
to make sure that the dogs, as you said, are confident. Now, for those that they already have the dog, they
Mhm.
didn't go through the right process, is there hope for them?
Yes, there's hope for them, and honestly, a lot of it can be reshaped. So before I got really into service dog work, I did a lot of aggression and behavior modification and rehabilitation, and I've seen some of the most traumatic and horrendous cases come out amazing. So the way that I look at it is if I can take a dog who wants to kill everybody and change their life entirely in a couple of weeks in a board and train, we can totally do that with a service dog as well. And it just has to, we need the genetic markers there. And it's also why I prefer that the pups are reared not in the same home that they're going to be working within. Because another way to think about it is imagine you grow up in grandma's house, there's no rules. And then all of a sudden you hit age 7. And now everything that you've been allowed to do for your entire childhood is punishable and is now an offense.
So it's more conflicting,
It
and it's
is.
easier if they go into a new environment and new
Correct.
rules are applied at that point. Often why it's easy taking dogs in for stay and train and switching the way that they look at training because they're no longer in their home environment. But that's also a little bit conflicting too, because then when we take the dogs back, we say now we have to make sure the training transfers over. A lot of times the dogs go back home and they go, no, no, wait. I do whatever I want here.
Mm-hmm.
And so someone has a dog or they went through the process, they have a puppy, they want to start training. what are the first things you want to start doing when you are working with a new puppy? And let's go down to the details. So someone who doesn't know
Mhm.
anything about having a puppy, but they know having a service dog is going to change their life. They bring the dog home, they have what the breeder gave them or wherever they got the dog, maybe a collar, maybe a leash, maybe a
Mhm.
kennel, and maybe a bowl, but not much beyond that. What are we going to do?
First things first is I would start with crate training and potty training, and I would show the dog that the freedom that they desire comes from going pee and poo on cue within a couple of seconds. So, you take your puppy out of the kennel, you put him where you want him to go to the bathroom, you give him 2 minutes. If he goes to the bathroom, now he can run around and play. If he doesn't, he goes back in the kennel, you wait 20 minutes and you start over again. Because going to the bathroom on cue is one of the smaller things that people don't think about with service dogs, but one of the most critical things if you are going to be flying with your dog or traveling with your dog is if you've only got a 40-minute layover between 2 6-hour flights, that dog must go immediately on cue.
And how do you start putting it on cue? Are you putting it on a verbal cue or just the act of placing the dog in a specific location?
I do both. So as the dog is going to the bathroom, I'll say the cue, and typically I name pee and poo differently so that I have the ability to say pee versus poo, and I want them to do both. So you want to say it as the dog is doing it, not stand outside and say, go potty, go potty, go
Mhm.
potty, go potty. And, then your dog's chaining that together, and the cue is 10 go potties because we have to remember they don't speak English. So as they're going pee, say, go pee, and then click, click, and jackpot them with their food. As they're going poop, go poop, click, click, and then jackpot them with their poop. What I also do differently than what other service dogs might do is because I do a lot of my work with e-collars, I will typically also have an e-collar on my puppy, even during their critical period when they are that young, on very low level stimulation. As they're in the potty yard, I'm just doing a very low tap, 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 just a little kind of nudge on the shoulder. And then as soon as they go to the bathroom, the stimulation shuts off, they get their jackpot reward. So that later, when I take them to a novel environment and I say, go pee, I can tap, 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 and it's already on cue with a must key.
As negative reinforcement. And when you're saying go potty, and to hit on what you were saying earlier too, also if you say it a bunch of times and it means nothing, that could also develop learned irrelevance, which is
Yes.
a big issue in the dog world because people tend to do that quite a bit by telling their dog sit, 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 sit. And
Yep.
now the dog learns to ignore the word sit because it doesn't mean anything to them because they have to figure out what's relevant to them. When the
Yeah.
dog starts to do the behavior that's the precursor of relieving themselves, is that when you say it? So I see the dog doing the little spin and I know the dog's about to go. Would that be a good opportunity to say go potty or go pee or poo or whatever?
It depends. In initially, I'll say it right as it's happening, and then I will use classical conditioning and I will say it just before. Because in classical conditioning, you want your unconditioned stimulus to come before your conditioned stimulus so that they can chain the two together.
Yeah, and that is something that I've talked about with a few other trainers. I had one trainer that reached out and he was a little confused because someone else had told him that dog says, or we say dog does. And it's
Mm,
like, well, that's a command. Is that how is that classical conditioning? Because most people see classical conditioning as what we use for our markers click, treat, or
mhm.
yes, treat. What's an easy way to explain how that works to someone who is new within dog training? Because classical conditioning, same thing with opera conditioning, those are both really big parts of dog training. And we use it
Yeah.
all the time, even if we don't know that we're using it.
Yes, absolutely. No, your dog is always learning. It's just, are you making the choice to have them learn what you want them to learn, or are they learning something else? So initially, it is a little bit operant because we're essentially putting a name over the act of what the animal is doing. And then once we start to see consistency in the behavior, that's when you want to give about that 1.2-second gap where you see them start to circle, you say go potty, and then they do it, and then you give them a reinforcer for it. But initially, especially with a young, happy, eager puppy, let's say they're right about to go to the bathroom, they're spinning, and you say go potty, and they're like, and just stop doing what they're doing and redirect all of their focus on you because you spoke to them.
That's a good
Um,
point, throwing in that distraction in the early stages, and sometimes little puppies can go pretty fast. You said earlier that you start with doing crate training. Now,
yes.
how do you do crate training specifically?
So I have my puppy live in their kennel every second that I am not directly observing them, so that there is not a single moment that they can find a behavior reinforcing that I maybe don't want. So another way to think about it is, kids with young parents, if you leave the room and you come back into the room and your 3-year-old drew a mural and Sharpie on your wall, who's at fault? The parent. But oftentimes with our dogs, we just give them this, we give this tiny animal the freedom to just do whatever in our home, and we take our eyes off of them for 1 second. And that just so happens to be the 1 second they decided that the table leg looked really tasty. And now they found reinforcement in chewing on it. And so you have to play the game of combating a punishment with something that is self rewarding. And another thing to keep in mind, if we're thinking about being really technical here, is once something becomes variably rewarding, we see a jackpot in their brain for the behavior. So if we think about why gambling is addicting, it's not because you always win, it's because you mostly lose. And it's the potential win that creates a huge dopamine spike in your brain that drives the behavior of pulling the lever over and over again. So let's say your little puppy is loose in your home and you took your eyes off him for a second because you're cooking dinner and he starts chewing on the table leg. And then the next time he goes to do it, he gets caught. And then sometimes he does it and it's rewarding, and sometimes he gets caught. Now we put a behavior on a variable reinforcement schedule, and we're going to have a huge dopamine spike that is driving the need to attempt to do that behavior again.
So it's going to increase the overall difficulty by not properly managing it. So when you say crate training, you're referring to what I often call house training. Do you do anything as far as creating positive associations to the kennel? Do you play kennel games or crate games where you toss in
Yeah.
treats, have them come out? What things do you do like that to make the kennel seem, or the crate to seem like a very positive thing? Because
Yeah,
some people, they're going
absolutely.
to put their puppy in their crate and the puppy's going to freak out and they're not going to know what to do.
Yes, well, I can tell you the one thing you should never do is take your puppy out when they're freaking out. Because we also have to keep in mind, if we're talking about operant conditioning and the release of pressure, as soon as you open the door, whatever behavior was happening in that kennel will be reinforced.
Mhm.
And that's just the nature of the game. So I like to put typically something soft in there with them as long as they're not going to chew it up. And, it's a kind of change as you go with the development of the dog. If they're teething, you want to make sure there's a teething toy. I like to have a white noise machine or something to kind of soothe them. I know
Mhm.
sometimes people will also put like a little toy in there that has like a ticking clock in it, so it mimics the heartbeat of the mother dog. Another trick is a nice warm water bottle so they can cuddle up to it. There's a variety of different ways that you can make the crate really rewarding, but the key is not necessarily to make the crate rewarding. It's to show the dog what behaviors you want to see before that crate door opens. And the first critical moments of that are going to be lasting impressions, especially if your puppy is in their critical period during this time.
Yeah, and dogs also train us. People say
Yes.
that quite a bit. And when we look at the situation that you're just talking about with the puppy whining or making a bunch of noise in the crate, as you said, if we let them out, that's positive reinforcement, something
Absolutely.
added after the behavior. Puppy whines, we let them out, giving them freedom, positive reinforcement. But the puppy is also using negative reinforcement on us. They make a bunch of noise until we
Mhm.
comply, and then
Mhm.
the noise goes away. And so waiting for them to stop. But what if the noise just keeps going and they don't, and the person's freaking out? Okay, this puppy is making a bunch of noise. They won't shut up. How can I let the puppy out? Because the puppy's not stopping. They just keep going, keep whining. Is there something they can do in that situation?
Typically, I like to just cover the kennel because
Mhm.
sometimes you have that fishbowl effect where the dog is restrained and they can see all this fun happening outside and they can't get to the fun. So covering the kennel, also making sure the pup has ample time to exercise and run around and play and train prior to putting them in the kennel. And I typically like to play with the age of the dog. So for every month of age the dog is, that's like a half hour that they can be in the kennel. So a 2-month-old dog can maybe go an hour before they need their next bio break. And I like to keep a journal of every time the dog eats, drinks, pees, or poops, anytime they train. And then I will learn the dog's regular routine. And then I will anticipate that routine and go open the kennel or let them out 2 minutes before they're going to start crying because they need to go to the bathroom.
I
But
love that.
keeping meticulous notes is key.
Yeah, all about management. I think management is so important in the beginning. And when it comes to the kennels and the crates, what type of crates do you like to use? I like the plastic, but I also use the wire ones. But when I use the wire kennels, I always make sure that when I first put them in there, they're not going to turn their head, try to bite. And then, of course, if they get stuck, which we've all seen that
Happens.
before if we're trainers, we
Yes.
want to avoid that from happening. So if they start to turn their head, I usually distract them from that. Maybe I'll say, hey, brrr, make some noise to stop them, to pull them out of that behavior. And then anytime I'm first introducing a puppy to a crate, I make it positive, just like you said. I try all these different things. And just like you said, I'm very, very big on safety. So I
Yes.
will watch to make sure, okay, this is stuff that they're going to be okay with while they're inside. Or making sure that we don't have certain things, like not leaving certain collars on dogs, even when they're older, especially when they're older, like a prong collar or something like that.
Yeah, or
It's
anything with tags. I've had
Mhm.
dogs that have gotten their tags caught in a wire crate and have almost strangled themselves
Oh,
because they
yeah.
panic and they pull back. So I prefer to put my dogs into the kennel naked
Mhm.
to
That's what I
limit
do.
those variables. And I also prefer the plastic ones. I don't really like using the wire crates because to me that kind of amplifies the fishbowl effect where
Mhm.
they can see everything and it's not necessarily mimicking the den-like properties that are where dogs prefer to rest. And, if we're thinking about their wolf ancestry, they're going to dig a den where there's no light, no noise, no odor. It's just a quiet little tiny nook, just big enough for them to stand up and turn around and lie down. So the closer we can get to what is already evolutionarily preferable for the animal, I think the better. And
That's
yeah,
actually why I use the wire crates.
really.
Use them strategically. So with the wire crates, this is something I picked up from Michael Ellis, and I
Uh-huh.
really like it. So he calls it inclusion. So
Uh-huh.
when you use the wire crate, so let's say you have two older dogs and you get a new puppy. The
Yeah.
two older dogs, you have them on their play stay or their climb stay. You give them their bully sticks or their treat, whatever it is. And then you have the puppy there as well in the wire crate. So it feels included, but you don't have to worry about
Mm.
control. Now, of course,
Mhm.
just like anything, some dogs that's going to work really well with, and
Yes.
other dogs they might freak out. So when I did it with Maverick, and with Maverick, it worked out really well. But each time, by the time we were doing that, he'd already had a lot of training during the day. He's been
Mhm.
physically active. And so it was nice. He's like, all right, I get to lay down. And I put the climb bed inside the
Oh,
wire
perfect.
crate. So everything mimics what the other dogs are doing, but I don't have to worry about enforcing a climb stay.
Yeah, absolutely.
It
And I
works
think
really well.
yeah, and I think for an older dog, that makes a lot of sense. But with a puppy, you want to make sure that they get ample time to rest as well,
Mhm.
because every training session, it is necessary for our dogs to sleep or have one or two REM cycles in order for them to do what's called consolidation. And that's taking something from short term and putting it into long term. So if you have a really good training session with your puppy, and then you continue to interact with them or they continue to have new stimuli, they just start to kind of data dump that session, and the new stimuli that they're seeing coming forward is going to be what ends up consolidating into their long-term memory when they finally do go to sleep.
Mhm.
So I think I would use both as, for different
Yes,
training exercises.
absolutely. And I also like to do what I call scheduled isolation,
Yes,
where
it's
I
so important.
okay, so you do that as well, yeah. I mean, I don't do anything fancy. I just put the puppy in a closed plastic crate, one of those that
Yep.
feel more like the den. I put them in a separate room. The white noise is great. I also do that. I usually use brown noise, but it's
Hmm.
the same concept. I just like the brown noise better. And I give the puppy something nice. I usually do the work to eat feeders where they can't eat
Nice.
through it. I'll fill it with frozen, or I'll fill it with raw dog food and freeze it, and then let them just
Perfect.
kind of gnaw at it. And then I'll leave for 30 minutes and they're by themselves. They get used to being alone, but it's a positive experience. Do you do something similar?
Yes, absolutely. It's really important for all dogs, especially service dogs, to learn that skill because they will become overstimulated in their life. And we have to have a tool to help combat that overstimulation, like giving them a quiet place to stay or just essentially taking them off the clock for a bit. And
Mhm.
if they cannot rest by themselves, then especially if you have like a medical alert dog, like my dog, he's under the table right now. He's not vested, but he's still doing his job. If he needed to give me a medical alert, he still would. And so you have to keep in mind that depending on the work that the dog is doing, we have to be the ones to regulate, telling them now you switch off so they don't
Mhm.
burn out.
Yeah. And I do want to get into the training. It's just every time I end up talking about a certain subject, there's so much to cover
So
in
much.
that subject. And I do want to hit a little bit more on some of the big things, the big ticket items for management.
Yeah.
So, what are some of the things for management where you're like, this is non negotiable? You should definitely do this when you bring a new dog or new puppy into the home because first impressions are often everything, especially with dogs.
Yes.
Even for me, even new training techniques or tools that I might be using, I always
Mhm.
try my best to make every tool, every new learning experience to be as positive as possible. Even if I'm
Yeah.
using a remote collar or a prong collar, people see those tools and they think they're horrible because they don't know much about it. And
Of
of course,
course.
countries ban them, or a trainer goes on YouTube and says the only thing this is good for is to be smashed, and they smashed it, but they're just not really educated on how great the tools are, but always making it a good positive experience. So
Yeah.
the non-negotiable requirements, let's say, for dogs that you work with and that you would recommend for somebody, like if you're going to at least do something, do this to help with the beginning, and kind of define a little bit more what management is for someone who may not be fully aware or understand what we're talking about.
Yeah. So, management, in my definition, is setting up your aquarium or environment so that the dog, when left to their own devices, doesn't have the opportunity to find something rewarding that we don't like. So, being very essentially being a hover parent and always keeping one eye on that dog. The absolute must do, especially for a service dog, but also pet dog owners, this is just going to change your life, is existential feeding. The worst thing I think you can do is as soon as your dog comes home, have the biggest first reward come from a plastic bowl that has nothing to do with you. I want my dog to be seeking me, seeking my hands, seeking my engagement and interaction to push them for a primary resource. And I want to start that as soon as the dog comes home. Another one would be charging your marker. So using that existential diet to immediately start charging a clicker, charging a yes marker, charging whatever marker you want to have the dog understand mean good things are inbound. And I like the decision that you made.
Do you use things like gates or
Yes.
playpens, things like that as well?
Yes, absolutely. I love playpens. We call it the Thunderdome in my house because, if you've got a bunch of puppies in a playpen, it does end up being a Thunderdome. Um, so I love having safe areas that are 100% confined in a way that there's no loose wires, there's no medication, there's no food scraps, there's no trash, there's nothing that those dogs can get into that is going to be potentially harmful or create an experience that they want to then mimic as an adult dog. That was fun,
Mhm.
like chewing a table leg. So having a baby gate system set up, having your detailed notes of when the dog needs to eat, when they need to go out, and having every meal time come through some sort of training exercise. Especially for a service dog, that's a really powerful time for you if you have like a medical alert dog that is alerting on an odor based marker, then that is a very important time to pair the odor with the food so that you can start imprinting the dog on, hey, when I smell this, a reinforcement is inbound. So that later on, when they smell that, they look at you and they start to push you like, hey, where's my money? And that's how you start to create the process of a medical alert. And I allow it to organically come from the dog. So whatever comes out, sometimes they bark at you, sometimes they paw at you or whatever. And then I can fine tune it later. But I like it to be the dog's own invention so that it's a very powerful learning moment for the dog.
And it helps increase the food drive as well, right?
Absolutely.
Which, when we're trying to train a dog, we have certain tools to get them to do certain behaviors. We talked about earlier the operant conditioning as well as the classical conditioning. And reward-based training is limited by how much the dog wants the reward. So if we can take the time in the beginning to build that food drive, to build that prey drive and that play drive, that is a very powerful tool that we're able to use later in order to manipulate the dog and to get them to do things that we want. A lot of times someone might run into an issue where they're dealing with a dog that's having, let's say, some kind of behavioral issue or fear response to something. And okay, let's take the dog to before they cross the barrier where they react. And then let's pair it with something pleasant, something positive. But if we don't have anything the dog likes, this now becomes very difficult. So building these drives that we can use as tools in the beginning is really important. And just like you said, if you have the dog come in and they start getting the reward away from you, the worst ones are those big plastic, like they have it, like the food just keeps coming out and dispenses at the bottom and the dogs graze on it. I used to always tell people, make your dog work for all their food initially, but I changed it because people are so set on what words mean, the dictionary definition. So they think work, oh, we're making them work. Why would you make them work? Okay, let's make them play for all their food. Because if we make the training fun and engaging, they want to come back for more, and we create that strong association to the activity that we're doing.
Absolutely.
Now, let's say someone has their house set up, and something I want to say too is I compare it to baby proofing. It's like we say baby gates and things like that. If you're going to have a new baby, you're thinking about all the things that you need for that baby. I have a baby changing station in this room. I have one in this room. I have the diaper pail there, diaper pail here. I have bottles over here. I have the little plugs in the electrical outlets. I have gates. That's what we're doing when we're prepping our house for a new dog, because the better we can set up the management. Yes, it takes some additional work in the begining, but it pays off. And
you're saving work.
Yeah. It's worth it. Totally.
Yeah, it's absolutely worth it. And also, if we're talking about the absolute 100%, what do you tell anybody bringing a puppy home? Don't spend every single second of your time with that dog touching that dog. Because we like to use praise as a reinforcer for our dog. And how many pet dogs have you met who honestly couldn't care less if someone said good boy or touched them? They're just like, whatever. And that's a lot of times because as puppies, when they're cute and they're little, anytime they do anything at all, you're like, oh my God, that's the cutest thing I've ever seen. Let me run over and just scratch you all over and tell you you're amazing. And then we ask that same dog to perform a complex task for one good boy and a pat on the head. And the dog's like, no, why would I do that? I get all of this for free. So the more you give your dog for free, the more pressure you will need to train behavior later.
Yep. And this is known as negative behavioral contrast, right? If we give a dog steak or we give them something that is extremely valuable, and then later we reduce the value of the reward, they go, well, this is no fun.
Yeah.
But the good thing is there's the opposite too, which is the positive behavioral contrast.
Yes.
If now suddenly they're getting a big reward for doing something and they're getting the food during training, like one of the things I do in my videos with the dogs that I train, or if I would have a dog in a stay and train program, I use their kibble for training. And ideally pieces that are big enough to handle, you're not dropping them all over the place, easy for them to eat. And then when I do the training with the dog, I use freeze-dried dog food. So it's not like I'm jumping up to steak or chicken or something crazy like that, but it is a boost. And because of that, once they smell that and they taste it, their performance is better. And that can be something we can manipulate in order to get nicer results in specific situations. So
Absolutely.
they have the house set up, management, everything's great. They're ready to start training. What do we
Mhm.
start with first?
Like I said, the crate training and potty training is huge. Charging your marker. And if you're preparing a dog to be a service dog, take that dog everywhere. And I mean everywhere.
Even
Take
before
it.
vaccines?
Yes. Yes. Now be smart. Don't take your
Mhm.
dog to a public dog park and put it in the middle of a poo patch. Like use your judgment, but if we're also thinking about the critical period in a dog's brain, so we talked about the sandbox and we talked about how the dog normalized everything that it saw during that time. And now those things are normal forever. If we think about the later stages after that critical period has then shut for that puppy, which does happen before vaccines, that is
Mhm.
typically their second set of parvo, their critical period's always already way closed. Um, how many times have you had someone tell you, like, my dog's scared of like a man in a blue hat? He must have been beaten by a man in a blue
Mhm.
hat, right? My dog's scared of mailmen. He must have had a mailman chase him and whack him in the butt or something. And the answer is that's probably highly unlikely. Your dog just never saw that picture during their critical period. So they
Mhm.
never generalized it. And so the more you can show your dog and have them normalize and accept things, the better they will be at the later stages and the less things they're going to see as, you want your dog to think that novelty is rewarding and that novelty is normal. If the
Mhm.
first time they go outside is after their critical period, after their second vaccine, and that's their first time seeing another dog walking down the street on a leash, or the first time an ambulance comes screaming past them and they have a fear response, it's not because that other dog attacked them or the ambulance ran them over. It's the same thing as that dog who saw a snake in the wild and naturally was cautious towards it. And that fear response saved that genetic material so it could be passed on to the next generation. It all comes down to the evolution of our dogs.
I like the way you said that. We want novelty to be normal.
Yes,
That's really quite brilliant. So, yeah, we want the dog to get used to seeing new things so that when it
absolutely.
does see a new thing, it's not this new experience.
Yes,
So, seeing something new is not a new experience.
exactly.
And when they
Exactly.
are taking the dog out, you said be smart about it. Don't take them to the dog park and put them where all the dogs relieve themselves. What are some of the areas that you like to take puppies in the early stages during that imprinting and giving them a positive experience? What's some of the gear you have on yourself? Do you have your training vest? Do you have treats? Do you have toys? What do you take with you when you take the puppy?
Yeah, I typically have food and I don't have it with me because I just loaned it out for someone who just has a kitten in critical period. But I have this little bubble backpack where the dogs can see everything, but nothing can really interact with them. And it's got little holes in it. So anytime I walk past, like, let's say a train for the first time, I reach back and just pop some food into the backpack, or a dog starts barking, I just pop some more food into the backpack. But the places that I want to take my service dogs when they're puppies during their critical period, I want to take them on a flight. I want them to see that picture during their critical period. I want to take them to a hardware store, maybe a baseball game. I want to take them to other friends' houses. I want to take them to places that are common for your dog to see in their future. I want to take them to a doctor's appointment with me. And during that time, what's really important is I'm not allowing anybody to interact with that puppy. And that's one of the trickiest things about bringing a puppy into a public space is you have an adorable baby, people want to come up and say hi. I never allow that to happen because there's two important things to consider. One, that dog needs to be focused on their handler and their handler alone. So if during that critical period they realize that they can get dopamine from the environment because other people can come up and make them feel good, other dogs can come up and make them feel good, then we are setting them up to fail in the later stages of their training when they're doing their public access work because they now see the environment as full of reward. I want my dog to just look at the environment and be like, it's just things. It's just normal. I see people, I see dogs. They don't interact with me. I don't interact with them. We all go about our day. I want essentially a very neutral dog that doesn't care about anything and isn't going to get that reward. So I'll bring their food. Sometimes I'll bring a harness typically and a leash because at that point in time, I don't want to be putting many controls on my dog. So I don't care if you can walk without pulling. I want you to pull. I have it there for safety. I'll have, poo bags and a way to keep everything clean. Um, and I like to bring like my clicker out with me. I don't really do much bringing toys out with the puppy because I want a lot of their reward out in public spaces to come from food specifically, because food is something that we can put on what's called a communistic reward schedule, where one task is one bit of food. And I don't like
Mm.
to use a variable reinforcement with a dog, because a variable reward, as we talked about earlier with the dopamine jackpot, is going to create a lot more power and enthusiasm and fire in a dog. And at some point, I'm going to need to take all of that power and enthusiasm, and I'm going to need to flatten it just enough that when my dog hands me an object and I mark, they are not slamming into my chest like, feed me.
Mm.
I'm going to be like, here's your pen, where's my food? Like, just very transactional.
That's very smart. And those are little things that we can do with all types of different training. One
Yeah.
of the mistakes I made was I always made the climb or the place, the elevated bed, whatever you want to call it, this very exciting thing where I would have the dog run to it, and then I'd use the terminal marker. The dog would run over, get the treat. I'd send them again.
Mhm.
They'd run back. We'd play tug. So it became this item of high energy and excitement. And then when I'm in the
Mhm.
house and I was like, go to your bed, the dog runs and they're standing on the edge, super
Mhm.
excited because they think we're about to do a very high energy type activity. So that's really, really smart, because we always talk about going to a randomized schedule to make the training a very specific way. But a lot of times we are looking at that higher drive. So
Yeah.
to say, okay, get the dog to understand one behavior, one reward.
Mhm.
With interactions, you said no interactions when they're out. Where are the puppies allowed to have direct interaction, and with who and what?
So I allow my puppies to have direct interaction with people who I know are going to do it appropriately. So nobody who's going to pick up the dog and swing it around or do anything crazy with, people who are going to interact with my dog appropriately. Typically, that's when I tag in like my family. My mom is also a dog trainer. My dad was a horse trainer. So they'll come up and, play with their grand pup for a bit, and it's a safe, neutral interaction. I'll have friends come over, and typically I I am the only one who's initially interacting with the dog for the predominance of that dog's puppyhood, but I want to have many social gatherings where there's multiple people and they can go around the room and they might jump up on people or sniff people, but most of my friends know not to interact back and they just ignore the puppy moves on, and it gives the dog a safe way to investigate novelty without the novelty being something that creates that big dopamine spike that they're then
Mhm.
seeking in their future.
Yeah, that's something that we would do at the Tom Rose School as well.
Mhm.
We would take a new puppy, not everyone, this was just with certain select students and students
Mhm.
that had really well behaved dogs, because we had a professional class and we had a master class. So if we had some
Mhm.
really good students in the master class, we would have them bring their dogs, friendly dogs, put them in the training building, put those dogs into a down, bring the new puppy in, and then let the puppy leave the handler and go attempt to interact with the dogs and the
Mhm.
people. And the dogs ignored, the people ignored, and the puppy
Mhm.
would go around, and then the puppy would say, well, everyone here kind of sucks, and would go back to its owner, and then that person would engage, and now the puppy had an opportunity to explore. None of this is as fun as you are, and then would
Mhm.
focus on them, and they wouldn't have to worry so much about restricting it because they gave the puppy an opportunity. Hey, go check it out. I'm telling you, it's not as fun as I am.
Yes, absolutely. And also we have to keep in mind the reverse side of that dogs are very black and white creatures. The reason that it's so easy to train them and work for them is because we've been selecting for dogs that pick up patterns almost instantly. If you had a herding dog that your livelihood and your livestock depended on, and that dog was not reliable, you were not breeding that dog. If they were able to pick up patterns very quickly, that's the dog that you're breeding, and those are the genetics that are being pushed through to the next generation. So it's really important to keep in mind that if you show your dog the picture, whether this be a service dog or even a pet dog, that when you go into a public space, the public will interact with you. You don't know about that dog's personality. You don't know if maybe they're not a social butterfly. You don't know if maybe they don't love human interaction, because there are plenty of dogs like that out there. And so if that's their imprinting period, is seeing that public spaces are spaces where the public can touch you and interact with you, well, right at about 8 to 10 months old, when that dog has started to reach the second period of their critical development, now they understand mortality, and they understand that not everything is going to be nice to them. And if they assume that every public person is going to touch them, and they see someone who maybe they're a little bit conflicted by interacting with, you get that first big blow up, because the dog's like, I'm just going to get ahead of this. I'm going to tell that person I want nothing to do with them before they have a chance to come over and touch me. And that's where reactivity is born in a lot
Yeah,
of our pet dogs.
the best defense is a good offense, right?
Absolutely. And it didn't make sense to wait till you got punched in the face to punch back.
Right? So I actually want to pull up a couple videos that I pulled off of your Instagram that's related to what we're talking about. So the first one to me is a lot of obedience, it seems, but
Mhm.
also what we were talking about earlier, that public access. So I'm going to play the video and then I'd like you to talk a little bit about it. Does that
Yeah,
sound good?
absolutely.
Okay, now I didn't hear any commands, but
Mhm.
I saw your dog doing a lot of stuff. What's taking place in this video? It's a very crowded location. There's a lot going on. What are we seeing there?
Yes, so that was my dog's first time and my first time in downtown Nashville. There's like a specific street where there's a lot of restaurants and bars. There's live music. It's very chaotic. There's a lot of ambulances and people yelling and a lot of drunk people, and just it's absolute pandemonium. So I wanted to make a clip showing how a dog should respond, how a good service dog who does medical alert should respond to an environment that is that stimulating. So I have him tasking off leash, and he is doing a lot of cues that are built into my behavior. So, for example, when I sit down, he automatically lies down. When I stand back up, he goes back into a heel, focuses his attention, and we move on. And also, in certain parts of the video, you can see if people get a little too close to me as we're crossing the street, he will switch from the left heel to the right heel and create a tiny little barrier. If someone's too close behind me, he'll start to walk behind me. So that is called an orbit, and it is something that I like to teach dogs. If you ever have someone who has PTSD or who struggles with people crowding them, it's just something the dog should know to do. And so you start by teaching it as a cue, and then using classical conditioning, you show the dog the picture that when someone steps within this distance, then I cue you to do the behavior. And you do reps of that until the dog starts to anticipate someone is within this distance. You're going to cue me to do the behavior. I'm just going to go ahead and skip that part and do the behavior. And then you jackpot reward them. And that essentially takes over. Same thing with like the sitting down. So the thing to keep in mind with a service dog is you have to do everything with this dog. And I also like to hang out with my friends and have a conversation and look around Nashville for the first time and be a human in these environments. And so if every 2 seconds I have to tell my dog, you should be in a heel position. Every time I sit down, I say, you should sit down too. Every time I stand up, I say, you have to come with me. Then I am losing out on the experience of being a human in the world with this dog. And so there are a lot of cues that I teach my service dogs that should happen based off my body language. If I sit down in a chair or on the ground, you should default to a down position. if I get up and I start moving, you should default to a heel position, and so on and so forth. If during my walk I drop something, you should, without being cued, pick it up, go in front of me, and stop me until I grab the object back. And so those are important things that, just make living with a dog easier. Another one that, I didn't show in a video is public bathrooms. I do not want my dog to lie down on a public bathroom floor. I also
Mm.
don't want to have to touch my dog until I can wash my hands. So my dog needs to be able to go into the stall, allow me to do what I need to do, and then heel with me without me touching the leash to the bathroom sink, and then go under the bathroom sink in front of me while I wash my hands so he's not blocking traffic, and then I can grab my leash. So it's a lot of little things in service dog work that I don't want to have to always cue, because it's taking away from the experience of the human.
So I have two follow-up questions for that. So
Yes.
first one is, how would you teach the one where your dog goes into the automatic down when you sit down? What's the process for that? If you could break that down step by step. And then the next one is, someone who is training, how long would it take them to get to this level?
Depends on how good you are at training.
We
But
know that's a common question that people often ask.
yes, absolutely. And if your training's consistency will only be as consistent as you are. So if you sometimes ask your dog to do something and they do it and you reward them, and sometimes you ask them to do it and they do it and you don't reward them, you're kind of muddying the waters, especially if you want a nice, stable service dog that is not on a
Mm.
variable reinforcement schedule. Now, to teach the automatic down, I start by showing my dog the picture that when I clip the vest on, there are certain obedience cues that I always ask them to do. Because when he's not wearing his vest, if I was to go sit down, he doesn't need to go sit down. But in a public space, he does, so that I can gather my things. So I start by teaching my dog that when the vest is on, that is when we're working. I'm only going to put the vest on the dog later on, once they already have some obedience built in. And as I sit down in the chair, I use my leash pressure. So I start by teaching my dogs that when they feel downwards pressure, they should follow that guiding pressure down. And also, I use low-level e-collar stimulation. So that tapping means you should do something, or there's a reinforcement opportunity. That's what I want my dog to understand the e-collar means, is that sensation means there's money to be handed out. How do I get that money? So I use the money is here, and then the directional pressure. I say nothing, they do it. I pay them. I stand up and I do the opposite. And we do many, many reps of that until the dog starts to anticipate that when I sit down and I start tapping, the next thing that's coming is likely to be downwards leash pressure. And let me just go ahead and offer that and see if that's what you wanted. And if it is, great, jackpot reward. I take the vest off, we play, or we end the session, depending on the dog. Some dogs ending the session is actually quite punishing.
Yeah, especially if they enjoy it.
Yes.
And I always tell people, it's really what we're doing is pattern. Like, the dogs are really good at pattern recognition.
Yes.
So if we can set up a pattern, one always leads to five, five is a treat, then the dog goes, well, I'm just going to jump to five so I can get the reward. Which,
Absolutely.
the funny thing is, I've noticed the opposite is often quite true. If a
Yes.
dog's doing something that they want to do and you don't want them to do, and it's a countdown, then they'll wait until the very last second before they do it. Which, I mean,
Absolutely.
it's kind of how people are, right?
Yes. Well, I mean, similar to how there's some people that if you have a group project, let's say it's due in 2 weeks, you write yourself a schedule. You're going to do 20 minutes a night, every night for 2 weeks. And then you have the other people who are going to wait till the day before, and they're going to sit down and they're going to cram. And that, to me, is a great picture difference between what we would call a dopamine dog versus an endorphin dog. An endorphin dog, a little bit of pressure is their preferred method of learning. Like, people who like tattoos, people who wait to the last second to cram. We're also more endorphin people, versus your dopamine dogs are the ones who write out that schedule, do 20 minutes a night. They don't want the pressure. They don't want that cram session at the end. And so you just have to know your dog and train them in the way that makes sense for that dog.
And cram sessions never work. At least you won't retain it. That's for sure.
Yes. Yes. You might
I
get
do,
it done, but you won't retain it.
yeah, exactly. You'll forget in a week. So I do have another video I want to bring up. So this one, it looks like you're using a very specific technique, and I would like for you to talk about that a little bit. And then something kind of interesting happens in this one. And let's switch over. Okay. I went a little further than I wanted. Okay, and we know where that goes. Okay, so what's going on in this video? What are we seeing?
Oh, I love that dog. So in this video, I am teaching this dog how to the ultimate behavior, or the end goal behavior, is go to the fridge and bring me a beer. And so we have separate sessions that we all kind of like chain together. I prefer to back chain that specific task. So initially, I am napopo free shaping the dog holding the object. And what I mean by napopo free shaping is that there is low level stim that tells the dog that there's a reinforcement opportunity. And when they do something, the stimulation goes away, and then a secondary reinforcement occurs, typically food. So that way, in the later stages of the behavior, I can use that low level stim as a way to say, no, you have to go get me that beer now. Because the tricky thing with just doing a positive reinforcement shaping game where the dog interacts with the object and the only exchange is food is, if the only exchange is food, then the only thing I can do if the dog doesn't want to do the behavior is withhold food.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not going to make you a good service dog, because you have to have dogs who must do the behavior when asked every single time. So I'm doing a bit of napopo free shaping with this dog. And then she pops the bubble water and it just sprays up my face. It sprays in her mouth. And the end of that video, after she does that, I basically jackpot reward her entire dinner, because I didn't want it to be an accidental aversive moment where she got too excited about the behavior. It's a Malinois German Shepherd. And now she doesn't want to put a can in her mouth. So that's how we kind of combated that.
It didn't seem like it was a deterrent at all to her.
No.
She seemed a little confused by your reaction and what happened, but she didn't seem to be afraid. That confidence building definitely pays off. And of course, genetics. There's two things that I do want you to go into detail on. Number one, you mentioned back chaining. What does that mean, and how is it involved in something like a retrieve? And then what free shaping is?
Yes, absolutely. So back chaining is where you take a behavior and you start with the end of the behavior, and then you work your way back up to the start of the behavior. So dogs think and learn in pictures. So recall is a great example of a behavior that is easier, in my opinion, to back chain. So I am going to start my recall training with teaching my dog that the reward comes from them sitting in front of me and me holding their collar. So I start by holding their collar and paying them some food, holding them their collar and paying them with food. And then I hold their collar and maybe wait until they offer a sit, and then I pay them with some food. And during that process, I will also have a little bit of low level stimulation, because again, I teach all of my dogs that means there's a reward opportunity and they can earn some money. It's kind of like when in the old movies, you ring the triangle, that means dinner coming in. So from there, what I'll do is I'll then put the dog on like a bungee back tie and maybe step back a few steps, and then show that same picture of my hand is out and open, and I begin my low level stimulation. They run to put their collar into my hand and sit down, and then I mark and reward, and then we do more and more and more distance to create a recall behavior.
And that's interesting with the level stim, how you said it lets the dog know that there's an opportunity for a reward or a reinforcement.
Mhm.
Because with low level stim, I use the tone very
Mhm.
similar way. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the tone.
Mhm.
And I know some people also use vibrate for that
Mhm.
as well. Something like leash pressure gives the dog a little bit more direction. Well, actually a lot
Mhm.
more. Follow the leash this
Yes,
way, follow the leash
exactly.
that way. So teaching it as, hey, something's about to happen, or if you offer up a behavior, there's an opportunity for a reward. So it's like, hey, focus up, you might get paid.
Exactly.
That's very interesting.
Yes, and I prefer to NAPOPO free shape most of my service tasks or just most of my obedience and also a lot of my just everything. I try and do it as much as possible because if we think about how dogs create those patterns and how quickly they're able to establish those patterns, well, that means that everything that we do when we're working with them becomes a part of the pattern, and we run the risk of creating a lot of like superstitious behaviors. So think of it this way: if you always ask your dog to sit by taking a piece of food and luring a upwards, directional with that food, well, now when you ask your dog to sit and that precursor doesn't happen, they're confused because that step was not part of their initial pattern. And yes, they can use classical conditioning to kind of put those pieces together, but ultimately, I want to have some kind of tactile way to tell my dog, I'm going to pay you, do something. Show me what you got, essentially. And depending on what you show me, I'm going to give you some amount of reward. It might be one piece of food, it might be your entire meal, it might be everything in between. So that I now have a tool to then later in every single behavior, if my dog doesn't sit and I initially NAPOPO free shaped it with the low level stim, and let's say luring as well, they're like, I don't really feel like sitting. The ground is cold. It's wet, whatever else. I now already have a language or a way to say to that dog, you must do the behavior. And it's not their first time seeing that sensation, because what I do see a lot of trainers doing if they're working with an e-collar or any kind of communication tool is they will free shape a behavior like a sit, for example, using a lure. And then the first time the dog doesn't do the behavior, that's the first time that they add upwards leash pressure.
Mhm.
But that then to the dog, because it's a pressure that happened after disobedience, by definition, that's positive punishment. And I'd rather not use as much positive punishment. I'd rather use negative reinforcement or turning off a pressure when a behavior is complete, so
Mhm.
that I can control the dog's interpretation of those communication tools, right? Because if that leash only happens when you're disobedient, well, we also have certain body language cues that we're giving. Our dogs know when we're upset at them, they know when we're frustrated, they know when we're pissed off. And if that is happening at the same time that we're grabbing the leash, they're going to start to build that same association.
I like the mindset shift though, with the because I haven't heard someone else explain it that way. I
Mhm.
use the tone for negative
Mhm.
reinforcement with my dogs, but it's
Mhm.
not this signal to where, hey, this is an opportunity where you can get a reward. I
Mhm.
use it for a lot of things like boundaries, stays, stop
Mhm.
messing with something. And I use it to where I treat it as negative reinforcement. If they comply, the
Mhm.
tone goes away. If they don't comply, it will transition to a correction. And that's what gets the reliability. It's very similar to avoidance or even escape style training. If I
Yeah.
tell a dog sit and I correct them into the sit is the warning, the verbal command for the dog to comply before the correction comes. Or
Mhm.
that's also very similar to what I'm doing with the tone. Big difference with the tone is, as opposed to if we're looking at traditional training where they start right away, day one, sit, correct the dog into the sit, down, correct the dog into the down, which of
Yeah.
course is going to be stressful. It gets fast results because of the high level of stress and demand, but
Yes.
not in usually the best way.
You sacrifice attitude.
Yeah, for sure. And so with the tone, it does go to the correction. And once the dog understands to comply, they comply very quickly. So I use it a lot. I'll do what I call morning explorations. I take the
Mhm.
dogs out and they can go smell and pee and do whatever it is that they want. If they get a little too far, or let's say I can tell they're getting into something and I don't know what it is, I'll hit the
Mhm.
tone and they'll come cruising over and I release it. And it's not stressful to them, but they also don't see it as, oh, there's the sound that means that this is an opportunity where I can get a reward if I pay
Mhm.
attention to my surroundings and I try something, which I can
Mhm.
see that creating a very activated, like that on and off switch for a
Mhm.
proactive dog, right?
Yeah,
One of the big downsides with just doing free shaping without putting it to this additional signal is the dog will start offering up random behaviors, especially when you're trying to work on duration, which it's good in the beginning, but we don't want to do too much. But if
absolutely.
we add that signal, it says now figure something out. That's
Exactly.
really, really cool. I haven't heard anyone else explain it that way.
Yeah, and it works out well because you're not gonna sacrifice attitude, right?
Hmm.
Because that stimulation means there is an opportunity to get reinforced, and so typically it does act in the same way as your tone where it could like, let's say my puppy is off and same situation, they're off getting into like some horse poop or something out in my yard, and I start my low level stim in the same way that your dogs will then leave that
Hmm.
behavior and do something else, my dog will do the exact same thing. um and it's just a difference between like for me, I prefer to use stimulation for that rather than tone because I don't want stimulation to be in the eyes of the dog, something that is inherently bad or something that happens during disobedience. I want the stimulation to be the push into obedience. And so that's why I shift it a little bit. And I typically
Hmm.
use the vibrate function on my e-collar in that same way, where the vibrate function means like, don't do that. This do
Hmm.
something else is essentially what I want my vibrate to mean. Whereas I want my e-collar stimulation to be like, holy crap, money.
Hmm. Yeah, and so then it's almost not even really like negative reinforcement. It almost becomes, as you said, a signal like, oh,
Mhm,
if I put myself in my own dog's position and I hear the tone, okay, I need to comply to something, I need to stop doing something, I need to
mhm,
run to Nate, or I need to go back to
mhm.
this day, whatever. And it works really well. And they don't really associate any stress with it because they
Yeah,
understand it. I did the proper training.
yeah,
But then if I was your dog and I start to feel that tapping, now my brain shifts to, ooh, I could get something right now.
yes,
What do I need to do to get something? So it
exactly.
becomes, in a sense, a positive reinforcement signal
Absolutely,
because they feel it and it's like, okay, what can I do now? That's unique. That's
absolutely.
interesting.
Yeah, absolutely, and the downside to that, I will say, because there's a downside to
Yeah,
everything. Everything's
everything,
got
right?
2 sides. So, the downside to that is when you have such a strong, like, "Oh my god, there's money in this for me," response to the e-collar, you have to go through the extra steps of creating the stability, right?
Mhm,
I
mhm,
like to create a very powerful, active dog, but it's also important to have stability. And so you have to use it in both edges, in both, flips of the coin. And so that is one of the downsides. But because there is such a stigma around e-collars and around different communication tools, one of the most powerful things I can show the owner is that when I turn that e-collar on, that little doo 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 tone from a Martin Systems collar, the dog is like slamming into the door, like trying to put their e-collar on. And that picture sticks with owners because even if an owner really understands how to use a tool, and even if they see the benefit of it, there is that inherent little ick from all of the different, things you read online and social media. And so
mhm.
I feel like if you go to put that tool on your dog and they're like, okay, put
Right.
the collar on, they're not gonna do it. Owners
Yep.
are unreliable. So I'd rather have I wanna create a dog that is gonna push them to put the e-collar on so that they do.
That's that same perception is reality. And just like
Mhm,
you said, there's pros and cons to all the different things that we do.
mhm,
And with the conditioning, initial conditioning of the collar,
mhm.
I give people a choice and I tell them the pros and cons to each. So, A,
Yeah,
you can do it to where basically we are classically conditioning the collar. We take the collar, we put it on, we do something fun, we take it off.
yes,
And if
yeah,
we do that enough, the collar is the precursor to the fun activity. So they see it, they get excited, or the
Absolutely.
noise that it makes when you turn it on. Now, the downside to that, if you do have a very high energy dog, and now they're having an involuntary response to the excitement that they feel
Yes.
from seeing the collar, sometimes it's difficult to get the collar on them because, or they'll push their head through. Like my dog Maverick, he gets so excited. I unconditioned him to it, but then I got lazy and I reconditioned him just because I
Yep.
only use it when I take my dogs off leash. And so when I grab it, he gets so excited, he starts running around and barking like Macaulay
Mhm.
Culkin from Home Alone. He's so excited. He's like, yeah, I'm home alone. And it's kind of obnoxious.
Yes.
And so the other side, I say, well, this is another option. You just put it on and off randomly, make it mean nothing. So it just becomes a
Yes.
part of their daily routine. So then it becomes easier to control. So again, pros and cons to
Yes.
each. Is that,
Absolutely.
do you go either one or the other, or do you have another option?
I will do both. My rule of thumb is typically the e-collar goes on is the cue that you get to leave your kennel.
So they stick their head out and they wait for you to put the collar on. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's a
And
great
then
way
they
to do
get to
it.
leave. And so it becomes such a habitual thing for the dogs that even when you have lazy owners that don't always remember to put their tools on, the dog's like, I can't leave. Like, I can't leave this door until you put that collar on me. And so they just sit there and they just look at you and they're like, can you
Put it on. Yeah.
do the thing?
That's definitely a good way to do it. And I do want to touch on one other thing before I pull up one last video
Mhm.
where you're talking about the consistency,
Yes.
rewarding one time, not rewarding, but then also being lazy, reinforcing a stay, not reinforcing the stay.
Mhm.
And often someone will say, we need to be really strict with the dogs. And I like to reverse it and say, we need to be strict on ourselves.
Yes.
If I make a rule, I have to follow through with it. And that is difficult
It is.
because you might be doing something. I don't want to deal with that right now. And
Mhm.
so being strict on ourselves and following through, we're going to have that dog that ends up being more reliable. I just wanted to bounce off of what you were saying on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's just, it's so critical to be strict with yourself and have that kind of self control
Mhm.
because we also see, so like my background is neuroscience. And so I'm very passionate about understanding learned helplessness in the brain
Mhm.
and what can create learned helplessness because I see it in a lot of pet dogs for
Yes.
that reason alone, that we are very inconsistent. And so we do something called variable punishment schedules, which
Yes.
we know create a lot of anxiety and depression and learned helplessness. So, a way to think about it in a human example is, let's say your curfew is 10 p.m. and sometimes you roll into your parents' house and it's 10:05, no big deal, 10:15, not a problem, 10:30, who cares? And then one day you roll in at 10:04 and they ground you, they take your car, they take your laptop. Like all of these punishments now all of a sudden happen. What that does is it ruins the rapport between you and your parent, and it doesn't teach that kid to make a curfew. It teaches their kid that they can't rely on that person to give the structure for those punishments. And we see that with our dogs as well. Like if you have a non-negotiable, it must always be a non-negotiable so we don't accidentally create anxiety in these dogs where they're like, sometimes I'm allowed to do this, but sometimes I'm not. And I don't know the difference because dogs are not capable of understanding circumstantial difference in the same way a human is. Like,
Well, and
I
even
know.
humans struggle with it.
Oh,
Like I said,
absolutely.
I think they have a term for it. I think it's called burnt child syndrome. I'm not
Yes.
100% sure.
It's
With
something along those lines.
Yeah, and with the dogs, I don't like saying be strict with the dog. And the reason why I say be strict with ourselves is because people take words very literally. And it's
Yes.
one of the reasons why I don't like using alpha, because people
Oh,
hear that and they think aggression. And
yes.
they think
And
dominance. And
yeah,
I don't want that. Same thing what we were talking about earlier. Saying I want the dog to play for food changes
mhm,
the way the person looks at the activity, even though I'm doing the same thing.
yes.
But if I say play, oh, it's a fun thing. Yeah, that's what we want. I
Mhm.
struggle with using the word wrong when I'm teaching people because I use the word wrong as a signal for negative reinforcement, but it doesn't mean you're wrong, bad
Yeah.
dog. But people hear that word and they think that. And if someone says you have to be strict on the dog, people
Mhm.
suddenly think like, oh, I got to be. It's like, no, strict on yourself means following through and doing it the right way.
Absolutely.
The words we choose are always so important to those that are listening. And so I always try to make sure too, when I'm talking to someone who's new, that they understand what I am explaining and they
Mhm.
understand the words that I'm using. So we're both thinking of the same thing. So,
Absolutely. And it's not that, dominance theory was disproven. We know that dogs are intelligent enough not to see us as other dogs.
right.
There
Yeah.
is dominance that exists naturally, but they don't look at us and say like, "Are you alpha? Are you dominant?" It's respect. Your dog will only respect you as much as you respect them, and it's that
Mhm.
mutual respect that creates that foundation for a relationship and rapport.
Yeah. Working on the same team. I think Patricia McConnell, whoever wrote The Other End of the Leash, I believe it's in that book. She defines alpha as priority access to limited or valuable resources. And I
Hmm.
think that's a good way to define it. I'm going
Mhm.
to pull up this other video. We're going to watch this. We're going to talk about this for a moment and then maybe a couple other final things.
Yeah.
So Heather, if you're working on a medical retrieval, what if I did place few other distractions along with it?
Yeah. I want you to go hide some of his toys, which he really likes, along with the medication bag that he's trained to retrieve. I want you to go hide both wherever you want. And then
Okay,
I
I'm,
will
I'm
ask-
gonna I'm gonna amp up the challenge. I'll probably put them in a bathtub.
Yeah, go for it.
Should I close the door or I'll leave the door half open?
Yeah, you can crack the door. But yeah, you're gonna take these and just go throw them all in the bathtub.
Without that. A cat that's interested in leftover pizza. There's some medication. There are some toys. And yeah, you're on.
Medication. Good. So,
Wow.
you did what he was supposed to do.
That's excellent. Now, how did you do that?
Yes.
Those are some massive distractions.
I know. So I wanted to give some background first. So the person who was visiting me, his name is Kashi. He is a dog trainer in India, and he came and spent the week with me learning about how to work with horses because he just got into like horsemanship and things like that. He's a phenomenal trainer. He makes amazing dogs. And in India, there is no such thing as service dogs. Like it's not a recognized ADA accessible requirement that you allow someone to have a dog as a piece of medical equipment like it is in the United States and other countries. So he wanted to see like, why does this matter? Like, why do you need a service dog? What can your dog actually do that another human couldn't replicate? And so he wanted to start by just challenging my dog. He's like, I don't think your dog is going to pick your medication bag over his toys. And I was like, okay, try it. And he's like, I don't think he's going to pick it over a pizza. And I'm like, okay, try it. Throw my cat in there. Like, just make it as difficult as you want. And in part of that video, you can hear him come into the bathroom when it's just looking down in the tub and you hear that deep sniff, 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 sniff sound, because he has been trained how to find that bag based on the odor of the bag. And so, what I trained my dog to do is to retrieve that bag on cue. So, I would mimic the symptoms of a flare up, and then I would ask him to go get that medication bag. And we started with just basic odor imprinting. This bag means money is coming. This bag means money is coming. This bag. And he's like, where's the money? And then he pushes and then money comes. And so that's how you build that kind of like active dog that you can then free shape those behaviors. Is you have to first start by creating the anticipation of reward, because it's the anticipation of reward that drives the frustration that leads to novel behaviors that you can then choose to reinforce and pursue or not. So we started with the odor of the bag, means money is inbound, and then touching the bag. And then he also does an unforced forced fetch. So we just layered that in, where when he is over an object and I tap on my e-collar, that means retrieve the object. And then from many replications of, or repetitions of me mimicking the symptoms and asking for the bag, my dog organically started to bring me the bag when I had symptoms. And that is what created the medical alert. And from there, he started just, right as the symptoms are starting, he's bringing me my bag and I would pay him for it. And then there was one night that he was outside my bedroom door in a bark and hold, and he's a Dutch Shepherd. It's really loud when he goes into a bark and hold. So he's just at the door, just bah, bah, bah. And I'm like, I'm going to kill this dog. I feel fine. Why is he waking me up? And I open the door and I yell at him. I tell him to go to bed and leave me alone. And I shut the door again and I go back to sleep. And then again, he's at the door, bah, bah, bah. And I'm like, I am going to murder this dog. I cannot believe he won't let me sleep. I feel totally fine. I did nothing that could have led to a flare up today. And I put him in the kennel because I'm so frustrated with him. And I ended up in the hospital within 4 hours. Like, it was one of the worst flare-ups that I've ever had for my medical condition. So from there, I was like, oh, okay, I need to listen to my dog. And from that moment, there was a shift in our dynamic where he now gives me typically a 2 to up to 4 hour heads up to an impending flare, so I can take that medication and prevent it from happening and prevent, needing to go to the hospital and run the whole gambit.
And how did they learn that? How does he recognize whatever it is that he's picking up to alert you? Is that just something he started to do and you identified it and created it as an indicator?
So it's something he just started to do, but I couldn't honestly tell you what he is seeing that I'm not. So we've talked a lot in this talk about how dogs are masters at putting patterns together. Now, I don't know if it's an odor. I don't know if it's a pheromone. I don't know if there's a tiny behavioral shift that I have that is the precursor to the symptoms that I pretend so that he can do the medical alert. And similar to like seizure alert dogs, we're still not 100% on the science of what they're able to detect that we are not. Whereas like a cleaner science is like, let's say, for example, a dog that does like an allergy detection alert, like they can smell the peanuts in the air and they can give you that medical alert. Or like a dog that is helping you with high blood pressure. We can use the swabs of the human right during that high blood pressure right before to train the dog on an odor alert. But some medical alert, we still don't know what exactly the dog is picking up. And some dogs do it and some dogs don't.
See, what I learned for the seizure alert, I was always under the impression that there's a shift in the smell. The dog picks up that smell, that change of odor, and then the person has the response. And after enough of those, pattern recognition, the dog smells it. Uh-oh, there's that smell. There's that smell. That means you're going to do what you do that I don't like. This is not good. And then if we can see that, we can identify that as the indication and even tell the dog, okay, once I see the dog reacting in this way, I can tell the dog what I want him to do, whether it be speak, nudge, or something.
Or retrieve the medication, whatever it is.
Yeah. So you're saying there's no confirmed science on it, but these are assumptions based on what we're seeing?
Correct. I've seen some papers, but I mean, my bias is going to come out a little bit because I used to do research professionally. I don't love the methods in a lot of that research. I don't love the methods because there are so many variables with the handler-dog relationship that, in my opinion, are not being properly controlled.
Right. It's hard to pinpoint. Yeah. Anytime there's a study, it's how well is the control? How many subjects are within the study? How many different regions? Yeah, there's so much that's involved with getting
There's
a proper
so
study.
much. Yeah, there's so much involved in that. And, versus like a very clean science is like a diabetic alert dog. We
Mhm.
know that humans smell differently when their blood glucose level has dropped or skyrocketed.
And you collect the saliva,
Exactly. And
Uh,
it's
how did you get him to the point where he was able to navigate through those very high level distractions? Because this really is a form of proofing. We're proofing
yes.
whatever it is we want the dog to do, whether it's a complex task like retrieving a medical bag or performing a sit in a crowded environment. How did you get to that point where you're like confident enough? Okay, put a pizza, put a cat, put toys.
Mhm.
He's going to retrieve it.
Yes. So, because during the learning stage of all of the behaviors I teach my dog, because they're all NAPOPO free shaped, meaning that there's partially that low level stim, that means there is the opportunity for reward. And also, there is the secondary reinforcer of food or play or praise. I already have a built in way to help my dog when they make bad choices without potentially polluting the behavior, right? So if I've got a dog who understands the verbal cue and the low level stim means you must go get that bag, then maybe I'll put their favorite toy next to the bag. And if they go for the toy, I can tap, tap, tap. And that's their like, oh, no, 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 something. I need to do something.
Mm.
Spit out the toy, they grab the bag, right? And then at the later stages, if they choose to be disobedient and blow off that cue, I already have a built in, no, you must get this bag. And there is no in, outs, and buts. And because it's that same language that they learned to find reinforcement through, I'm lessening my risk for an accidental scar where, let's say, for example, I didn't use low level stim to build a lot of behaviors in my dog. And then they go to grab the incorrect object, and that's when they feel stimulation. Well, if they've never felt stimulation or they think stimulation is a bad thing, we can't control our dog's interpretation of what part of the positive punishment is being punished, right? Like, is it because I grabbed the toy, or is it because I looked left before I grabbed the toy, or is it because the room smells like pizza, or is it because, and so on and so on and so on. And so it's another way to kind of control variables when you are at the proofing stage of behavior without accidentally creating an aversive moment where the
And
dog's like, okay, never go near anything.
what's the no? So one situation, you have the toy and the bag. You're
Mhm.
doing the low level stim, which means figure out what it is that I want you to do so you can get paid. Grabs the toy, it doesn't stop. Okay,
Mhm.
that's not it. Grabs the bag, it stops, brings it to you, he gets the reward. What if he grabs the toy and he's like, this is fun, and starts
Mhm.
playing with the toy, shaking it, and trying to have a good time? What's the, hey, no, that's not what we're doing.
Mhm.
We're doing this. What do you do in that situation? What
Yeah,
tools do you have to have in place in order to control that properly?
absolutely. So in moments like that, my favorite punisher in operant conditioning is negative punishment. If they choose that disobedience, the session ends, you go in your kennel, your food is not going to come tonight. You got to wait 24 hours before that restaurant opens again. And the reason I prefer to use negative punishment is because so much of my interaction with my dogs is positive. In that moment, let's say I did a big e-collar correction, for example. There's a chance that would work, and for a lot of dogs it would. And there's a point in time in their development that I might just increase the stimulation level. So it's not like a tap on the shoulder. It's like a, hey, you have to do this. But then we're playing with what's actually more important to the dog in that moment, the correction or the reward of playing with the toy. And I just don't like to gamble. I'm not a gambler. I like the scientific method. And so for me, it's cleaner to just end the session. I have a negative punishment marker that I train my dogs that when you hear this negative punishment marker, that means that you are done working for the day and all reinforcement opportunities have now closed. so that that exact moment can be marked in their brain, that exact behavior, and they're not thinking the whole way back up to their kennel, what was it that I did that made this session stop?
And if he has the toy, when you use the marker that predicts negative punishment, is that also a signal for him to release, or do you have to go make him release it?
Typically, when my dogs are entering the kennel, I teach them they have to drop objects upon entering the kennel or upon leaving the house. So like if I don't want my inside toys going outside, so they have to drop their toys as they cross the threshold, and I do that with the kennel as well.
Okay, so if you make that marker for negative punishment, you go, you take him upstairs. Do you have to use a leash, or he knows just to follow you? And then once you get to the kennel, he's going to release it automatically and go in the crate. And you've done that through teaching the out, probably doing value transfer or something similar.
Yeah, and I mean, it also depends on the development of the dog, right? Like if this is a dog that I think might make the wrong choice, I'm going to have a leash on them and I'm going to physically block them from making the wrong choice. Like I'm going to set them up for success. This is like, I'm talking much, much later proofing stage. This is a complete behavior. My dog understands this behavior. My dog understands the kennel rules. They know the negative punishment marker. It's just done. If I say done, yeah, that's it.
So your system of communication is very well established.
Yes, I wouldn't use the communication unless the dog understood the communication. And let's say, for example, I think my dog is at that point, right? I think my dog understands the behavior very well. They know the cue, they understand the e-collar, they know how to go retrieve the bag. And in that moment, they go grab the toy. Well, if the attitude of the dog when they grab the toy is like, yes, I did it, I messed up, right? Because the dog's attitude is always indicative of their understanding of a behavior. It's kind of like when you tell your dog to sit and then they down really powerfully and stare at you. In that moment, I'm not going to punish my dog because he's doing that with confidence and he believes he's correct. And so I don't want to ruin my relationship with that animal by then punishing him for thinking he's correct, because chances are I messed up somewhere. I need to go back and I need to change things.
That's a great example. It definitely makes it more clear. It's almost like when I talk about incompatible behaviors, I like to use the example of loose leash walking. Like you can't walk forward and not pull. You can't, if I say you can't pull the leash and walk forward at the same time, then that means you can't pull on the leash.
Exactly.
You know, or it's like you can't jump up on people if you're on your climb stay, right?
Exactly.
So having those analogies, definitely, or not analogies, but comparisons rather. I like the blocking too. That's really important. Blocking is something I think that's often underrated. If we can use it the right way to communicate to prevent those mistakes early on. And also having a system to know what to do in certain situations. So one of the things that I do, if I accidentally, or not accidentally, it gets to the point where we start teaching a dog verbal commands and they start connecting them and they do what you say. You say sit and they go into the down. They're like, is this it?
Yeah.
I usually say that I give myself two options. Either option A, I pause for a moment and I ask the dog the question again. You know what a sit is. Dog sits. Okay, now I reward the dog. Or option B, I just give them the answer. So I say sit, they go into a down, and then I just bring them up into the sit, and then I reward them. And I like to compare it to if a child is learning math and I ask them what's 2 + 2, and they say 3, I could either A, say 4, or I can ask the question again. What's 2 + 2?
Exactly.
And you're right. If they go grab the toy with enthusiasm and it's next to the medical bag that they're supposed to retrieve, and then you punish that, now you just shut down and killed that motivation.
Absolutely. And now you just made so much more work for yourself, where now you have to go back to the starting point and build a retrieve all over again.
I agree. Sorry, you were going to say something else?
Yeah, I was going to say an example that is also like a good one for people that's very clear is in nose work. Like, let's say you're teaching a dog how to do like an article find or like tracking. And we have to teach the dog that it's the odor that spontaneously creates the reward, because we need them to lead us to the reward, right? If I'm part of that circuit, then they're always going to need me to hold their hand and bring them to the odor, because that's how they put patterns together. But because that's the classic way that we teach dogs to go find odor, we don't have a built-in way to say wrong odor. And so instead, when we think we're saying wrong odor, what we're really telling the dog is never hunt again. Or at least that's the dog's interpretation.
Or we can cause a line.
Yes.
If we start punishing, I mean, I've seen this on tracking specifically.
Yes.
Start punishing the dog, and then the dog is like, all right, I'm just going to act like I'm doing the right thing. And I don't know whether or not they're lying or if they're just not sure of what they're supposed to do, right?
Yes.
Because the track will turn and the dog will keep going straight. You said that you'll take the dog and you'll put him in the crate. Now, I agree with you. I will use the crate as punishment, but people hear that, and there's a lot of trainers out there that will hear that and they go, oh, never use the crate as punishment. But again, people hear the dictionary definition and they think punishment, bad dog, you're getting in the crate.
Yes.
But I always try to teach people it's cause and effect. I'm just being compliant to the dog. If the dog does a certain behavior, they're telling me as the human what to do, and I'm being a good boy. Okay, you want to go in the crate. All right, I'm going to take you to the crate. And then when you put them in there, because I'll even do that with a puppy. If I'm like, I prefer to leave the puppy if they're in a playpen, like just walk away as negative punishment for the biting. But the crate works as well. The puppy goes to bite the hand, and I go, oh, you want to go in the crate? Here you go.
Yeah, exactly.
And oh, he's like, I'll be darned. I don't want to go in the crate.
Yeah, like what happened? No, it's like
they're not traumatized from it, and it's not like get in there. And that's why, you know, these words that we use like punishment, we're using the technical terminology, negative punishment, positive punishment. And I was talking to someone once, a trainer, and I said condition punisher, just like a condition reinforcer. And they gave me this look like, you shouldn't use that. And I'm like, why not? Because that's what it's called. We need to educate people on what these words mean. It doesn't mean we're becoming hostile. It means we're using operant conditioning, which shapes behaviors through extrinsic motivators. We can get it to the point where it's intrinsic. Amazing. Great. That's the goal.
Yes.
And that's part of what you were saying earlier with the classical conditioning, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, you know, when people think of putting their dog in the kennel as a punishment, it's not, you know, I'm not throwing that dog in and bad dog and shaming him or whatever. And I know there's trainers who believe in that. I don't personally believe in that. But I literally, like in that session, I just say, done, grab their leash, walk upstairs, they go in their kennel, and then that's it. Like it's no big deal. You know, I might even throw some food in the kennel for them as they go in, because it's not the kennel that's punishing. It's not being in that environment and not being with me that is punishing. And that's what's most important, is that I'm being fair to my dog in how I do that. It's like if you go to a restaurant and you start throwing things on the floor, they will make you leave. Like you said, it's a consequence.
And I think it's becoming more commonly used now in very effective means. So I'm hearing it from NAPO trainers. I'm also starting to hear it quite a bit from TWC trainers, training without conflict. One of my friends who's a really great trainer, Maureen Cuccinella, which I'm going to have her on, I think next week. And she's excellent. She recently went through the TWC program. And she's like, you know, I never thought of using negative punishment the way in which I've learned how to use it in this course, and it's massively changed the training. The attitude of the dogs is significantly higher, and she was always a great trainer, so she's just adding additional tools, but knowing how to use these the right way. And that's why I'm also really big on terminology. I don't like when someone goes, I don't care about terminology. Understanding the terminology helps you plug things into your system and to have a proper understanding of what's taking place. I don't ever want to be in a situation where I say, you know, it works, but I really don't know why it works or how it works. I want to know exactly why and how. I mean, even when I use tools like markers, for example, I always try to get my students and my clients to understand, what is a marker for? I say it's to bridge the gap between the behavior and consequence. It's to pinpoint fine details in our training. And it also gives us the ability to release and reward simultaneously, especially when we're specifically reward markers.
Absolutely. Well, and I mean, words matter, because if you think about it, if we're going to have an intelligent conversation as peers about a very nuanced dog training aspect or cue or whatever, and I'm talking about human aggression and you're talking about human aggression, and what we are picturing is different, and we're fighting about it, that's because we're talking about different things. I'm picturing an orange, you're picturing an apple, and we're probably on the same page. And I think that's
Right.
where a lot of animosity in the dog world comes from, especially with the positive reinforcement community and the balance community. It's not that we are training different ways, it's that we are defining things differently, and just differently enough that we're fighting over it.
Right. And it's specific techniques too. A
Yes.
lot of the techniques pure positive trainers use, we use a lot of those. In fact, a lot of the foundational stuff is used primarily with reward-based training. Another one of a friend of mine who's a really, really excellent trainer, and he just keeps getting better and better. I was talking to him maybe about a year or so into his career, and I was telling him, you need to learn these different types of terminology so you can understand what's going on. And then he told me about a situation with a dog that was afraid of people. And then he's explaining it to me. And then he says, actually, I think that might be counter conditioning. I'm like, that's exactly what it is.
Yes.
Counter conditioning. And so the more we understand these details of the words we're using, the easier it is to plug it into the system. So I always encourage people to learn as much as possible. Now, something else that's interesting with dog training, a lot of it is transferable to people, but I'm curious how transferable this type of training or concept is to other species. And I know you've trained lots of different other species. Which one specifically was the most challenging to train a specific task on?
Yes, I would say the most challenging species and task was I trained Monodelphis domestica, which is a South American short-tailed opossum, to navigate a maze based solely on their somatosensory cortex or their whiskers. So they had to navigate a maze based off of textures from different sandpapers, in a experiment that I did many, many years ago.
Now, are you physically handling the
Yes.
possums? How does that
Oh,
work?
yes. Yes, no, there's a whole so my job before I was training dogs was I would basically act as a liaison between neuroscientists and like I would bridge anatomy and behavior. So they would tell me, "Hey, these are our neuroanatomical findings. This is what we're seeing in the brain. How can we turn this into a behavioral study so we can actually see if there's a behavioral change in the animal? And then how do we train the animal to do that? And then how do we record it? And then how do we analyze it and turn it into like a complete study? Because in order for something to be a complete study, you want to see both anatomy and actual behavior for it to be relevant in the scientific community. So that is how I ended up getting into that. And so yes, I was training the possums. They were click charged and would do just about anything for a cricket. So crickets were my most common reinforcer that I would use with them. I had one that I trained to do a backflip on cue. That was an accidental free shape that I thought was just the coolest thing. So naturally I marked and rewarded and then put it to cue. But I initially had to go all the way back to showing these researchers how to start handling the animals first, because they wanted me to train adult unhandled possums to do this very complex task. And I don't know if you've ever worked with possums, but if they are even slightly intimidated, they freeze. And so you'd be in your training room for hours because somebody sneezed and everybody went still, and none of the possums would then move again for several more minutes, and you'd have to basically scrap it and start over. So I started by having the researchers just every day during when the possums were cute little babies, you just take them and you just put them in your lab coat pocket for 20 minutes as you go about your day, and just pop a cricket in there and just hang out and just show these possums how to be out and about and not have that freeze response for every human sound.
That's so cool. And I'm sure it probably added to your skill set and your ability to be able to train dogs so well. And, we're not perfect, and dogs really don't need us to be flawless handlers, but they do need reliable ones. And you showed up today. Now, if you can you show others how to do the same, where can they find you?
Yes, and thank you so much for having me on the show. So you can find me on my Patreon, and we'll put links up. You can find me on Instagram. I'm Canine Advocate Heather. You can find my website, thecanineadvocate.com. You're welcome to reach out to me on Facebook, although I'm not very reliable on there. I also have a YouTube channel as well. I do virtual coaching. I do schools all around the country. So I have a couple of, future and upcoming opportunities for you to work with me in person. So there's various ways that you can get a hold of me. I love to travel. So the further you live from me, the better, because I love to come to you and set up a school. And I also wanted to just say, since we're talking a lot about operant conditioning, I do have a YouTube video that is the very just basic outline of the 4 quadrants of operant conditioning. So if we're talking about that today and you're confused about the definitions, that's just a quick video that you can pop in, and it's just the basic science and the actual definitions of operant conditioning.
Beautiful. And I appreciate you taking the time and sharing your wisdom with us today. And that's a wrap. So, as always, lead with clarity, train with purpose, and we'll catch you next time.
Excellent.